All right. Hello, and thank you all for joining us for the Research Center Presents. Now to the important part. Tonight's presenter, Allyse Freeman, is our Museum and Research Center Director. She also serves as our curator. She received her bachelor's in history, anthropology, and geology from Augustana College and her master's in anthropology and museum studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her primary passion lies in labor history and how its historical relevance can be used to gain economic and social justice for workers today. Allyse's accomplishments at MDC include creating 4 award-winning exhibits that brought new perspectives to local history. Her main goal for museum work is to present local history from a bottom-up perspective. This means focusing on the lives of everyday people and the stories of those who have previously been ignored or silenced. Steering away from the traditional textbook version of history is imperative and can be seen in all of the exhibits she has worked on. Tonight's presenter, Allyse Freeman.
All right. Can you guys all hear me? Is it a good volume? I can always speak louder as well, but I don't know, just throw something at me if I'm too quiet. So thank you, Alex, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming to our 3rd ever Research Center Presents here at MDC. Tonight, as you guys know, I'm here to present on the Hibbing 7 strike, where Linda Carpenter, Betty Yudnich, even if I'm mispronouncing things, please yell at me because I don't want to do that. But Betty Yudnich, Mary Suzik, Ruth Johnson, Roberta or Bobby Hisemovich, Marge Richards, and Linda Perry stood up for their economic rights for over 4 years against American Linen Supply Company. So while the first 3 Research Center Presents just happen to talk about Iron Range labor history, I swear I did not plan it that way. As Alex mentioned, Iron Range labor history is a particular passion of mine, and so it just happened. It won't be forever. Although labor history is very integral to Iron Range history as a whole. So this presentation is actually several years in the making. So over the course of researching for our permanent exhibit downstairs on over 100 years of Iron Range labor history, I came across the story of the Hibbing 7 and was immediately transfixed by the militancy of these women throughout those 4 long years. Sadly though, thanks to the nature of exhibits, their whole story was sadly relegated to just 1 panel downstairs. But it had been in the back of my mind to do something more in depth for these women. And so, thanks to a couple people that attended our Research Center Presents during Ty Hiltonen's presentation, he's in the audience tonight, the Hibbing 7 got brought up. And so with March being Women's History Month, I thought it was a perfect time to finally put all of the research that I had done on paper and come up with this presentation that you all are about to see tonight. Hold on. Okay. So I have several friends in the audience, or just people who know my style with history, know that I can't simply just talk about one historic event by itself. History does not operate like that. Too often our media or our textbooks or even documentaries don't provide the proper context for these types of moments, and we are left thinking that strikes or protests just simply emerge out of nowhere, or they're just flashes in the pan with no other context. And so, to me, that's an incorrect way to tell historical stories. And if there's one word to describe, I guess, my paradigm of doing history, it is context, as you can see up here, right? So you always need to place things in their proper historical context. And so, furthermore, when discussing local history, it's always important to add these stories to the overarching regional, national, and sometimes even international patterns. As a historian, it is therefore my job to ensure that this topic is seated well contextually. There is an immense historical precedence to what happened to these 7 women, and it's important to cover both then the historical and the economic story. And so we will absolutely be taking some tangents tonight, but please bear with me. It all has a purpose, and there is a plan to how I'm going to outline this story. So here is a basic outline of what to expect from me tonight. So first off, I'm going to provide you with a basic overview of the labor movement, as well as working class conditions in the 1980s. amongst these items, we'll go over Reagan's ascendance to presidency, the PATCO, or air traffic controllers strike, the Hormel strike in Austin, Minnesota, and then the tactics used by companies at this time to skirt unions. So after I've bombarded you with what I think is enough context, we can get then to the nitty-gritty of the strike itself. And so this will include why and how it started, the long road to economic justice, and then how it was concluded. So again, for those of you who know me, you'll know that it is an impressive feat that I cut myself off to only start this story in the 1980s. Because honestly, if I had my way, you guys would have started in the 1860s, and we would have just continued on. So the other thing to keep in mind is that probably what I'm about to talk about initially might kind of come off as a little depressing. Not the Hibbing 7 story, not that. That's a cool story. That's a good story. But some of the context in the 1980s specifically, it was a very dark time for the US labor movement. And this isn't meant to be a Debbie Downer for any of you guys. What this is meant to show is, one, the truth about the American labor movement at this time, and two, to demonstrate the odds that these women were up against at this particular time. And so with that, the late 1970s, I lied, I'm actually starting in the late 1970s. Sorry about that. I know, I'm sorry. So the late 1970s were truly the beginning point for a downward spiral of the American labor movement. What gains it had made in the 1930s and the 1960s, or through the 1960s, were going to be very short-lived. This decade was the opening salvo against working people of our country, and we would only get worse then in the 1980s. After the end of the Vietnam War, America had shifted a lot of its production focus away from American-made manufacturing. So therefore, countries like Germany or Japan at this time flourished while we entered stagnation. This stagnation then sparked big businesses, to realize they needed to strip away the power of unions and working people if their profits were going to continue to survive. In fact, in the mid-1970s, an article in the publication Business Week summarized the mood between CEOs and average workers quite well. Quote, "It will be a hard pill for many Americans to swallow, the idea of doing with less so that business can have more." The post-World War II social contract between labor and capital was officially over. And this was all prior to 1981. During the summer of that year, newly elected President Reagan would set the ultimate tone for how both the government and companies would deal with workers for the remainder of the decade. Following stalled union contract negotiations in early 1981, about 12,000 air traffic controllers of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO for short, they walked off the job on the morning of August 3rd, 1981, which happens to be my birthday, not the year, but the day. Anyways, I can't not say, like, when you hear it's your birthday, you can't not but say, hey, that's my birthday. So anyways, their grievances, though, were over unsafe and stressful working conditions. Keep in mind, too, that this was a union that supported Ronald Reagan's campaign. In fact, he wrote a letter to the president of the union in support of their efforts to get better working conditions, which you can see here. He stated, quote, you can rest assured that if I am elected president, I will take whatever steps are necessary to provide our air traffic controllers with the most modern equipment available and to adjust staff levels and work days so that they are commensurate with achieving a maximum degree of public safety. Reagan's loyalty did not extend as far as the union thought it might. Within hours, he was on national television demanding that controllers return to work within the next 48 hours or they, quote, will have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. True to his word, President Reagan fired all 11,345 controllers on August 5th, 1981, and banned them from federal service for life. Replacement workers were quickly brought across the picket line, which would signal to other companies that this was now the status quo. There's a local connection as well to this strike. 22 PATCO members at the Duluth airport went on strike during this and were subsequently fired. Furthermore, Steelworkers president of Local 1938, Joe Samardzija, stated in the Duluth News Tribune on August 21st, 1981, quote, I believe that Reagan is a pawn for big business. And if anyone doubts this, then they haven't looked at the budget cuts and tax cuts to see who came out smelling like a rose. And it sure as hell isn't the workers in the country. So by October of 1981, the union was decertified by the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And this again was the opening salvo that companies needed to see in order to know what the tone was for how to handle labor. If President Reagan could dispatch almost 12,000 workers from a fairly innocuous and politically conservative union who had supported his presidential campaign in the blink of an eye, it was open season on other workers. Thus, union busting and the forcing of concessions were now the order of the day. Employers were able to take advantage of the full, let me restart this. Employers were able, also if you can't tell, I'm getting over like a 2-week cold, so sorry if my voice is a little scratchy, that's why. Anyways, employers were able to take advantage of the fallout of PATCO, a countrywide economic recession, and rising unemployment rates to demand massive contract concessions. Industry after industry came under attack. Demands included wage cuts, wage and pension freezes, reduction or elimination of automatic cost of living adjustments, and the establishment of permanently lower pay scales for newly hired workers. Even after the recession ended, it was too late. The die was cast on what could be on the chopping block. And again, according to a 1982 Business Week survey of 400 executives, nearly 1 in 5 admitted, quote, "Although we don't need concessions, we are taking advantage of the bargaining climate to ask for them." These statistics would only get worse. 1/3 of workers with a new contract agreed to wage cuts in 1983. Even as the economy got better by the end of the 1980s, almost 3/4 of all contracts that covered thousands of workers had concessions by 1987. U.S. Steel, in particular, closed 1/3 of its remaining steel mills in 1983 after it had received concessions from the Steelworkers Union. So the 1970s and 1980s also, like I mentioned, welcomed a resurgence in union busting. So rather than Pinkerton guards beating strikers in the streets, although scenes like that still do play out, the focus shifted to firms that specialized in misinformation campaigns in the workplace. And so it was estimated that there was more than 1,000 union busting consultant firms operating in the US in 1979. And by the mid-1980s, we're spending an estimated $500 million on union busting. Companies during this time became more brazen about breaking labor laws. Between 1957 and 1980, the number of charges of unfair labor practices filed against employers grew by 750%. Employers were willing to pay the minimal fines to the government to prevent a union vote from being successful. At the same time, union representation elections had increased only 54% during the same time period. So overall, these these efforts culminated in a dramatic drop-off of union membership in the United States. Union participation hit a peak at 35% of the workforce in the 1950s, but by 1980, just 23%, or some 24 million workers, belonged to a union. By 1986, that number had fallen again to just 17 million union members, which was then 18%. And at the end of the decade, it was sitting at 16%. So how were employers able to succeed at these kind of numbers, this quick switch? So they had a multi-pronged attack to rid their companies of unions, and every single one of these tactics would be used against 7 women from Hibbing, Minnesota by the end of the decade. So this has taken, these 4 tactics that are kind of the summary of what happened that decade, are taken from a book called Hard Work, Remaking the American Labor Movement. And so they used a 4-step process to describe this. So the first step is bargain to an impasse. And so connected to the above section on concessions, the employer would essentially give the union untenable demands that they knew that they could not bring to their union to vote yes to the contract, right? And basically they had stopped negotiating in good faith, which was a cornerstone for previous contract negotiations in this country. The second step is provoke a strike. Once negotiations reached an impasse and the contract expired, the union would then either have to yield to the untenable demands or go on strike. And a strike is literally the most powerful tool in a union member's arsenal. It's seriously been curtailed in this country over the past few decades, but it is a last-ditch effort in obtaining democracy in the workplace. And the third step is hire replacement workers. So after a strike is declared, employers then hire replacement workers, i.e. strikebreakers, to continue the work of the striking employees. This then removes the pressure on the employer to reach a settlement with said strikers. So the hiring of permanent replacement workers then leads directly into the fourth step, which is break the strike and then eventually decertify the union. So replacement workers were encouraged by the employer to petition the government to officially decertify the union. Once 12 months had passed since the strike began, only these replacement workers could then vote in that decertification, thus ridding the workplace of the union. And so throughout the 1980s, approximately 200,000 workers became non-union thanks to this practice. And so while these tactics were used across the country, they were deployed during another major strike in Minnesota history, the 1985 to 1986 Hormel strike down in Austin, Minnesota, with the local P9 workers. And so I know, obviously, we're not in Austin, Minnesota, surprisingly enough. But this was such a major strike in the state that, again, it helped set a precedence of what these 7 women would have to face. And so I will very, very briefly go over that strike. Excuse me, there we go. So again, early 1980s, there was a national recession. The Hormel plant in Austin, Minnesota was no exception. So workers there were facing basically wage and benefit freezes. They entered a contract negotiation that, again, proved to just be so untenable. The workers could not agree to it. And then about 1,500 workers that were part of the local P9 union began a strike on August 17th, 1985. And so while they set up picket lines and rallies with great support from the community, management closed the Hormel plant then from August of 85 to January of 86. So the strike eventually gained national attention, and a boycott of Hormel products ensued. So I don't know, maybe people in the audience remember this. I was sadly not born yet, but anyways. Eventually, when the plant did reopen, management began to accept applications for replacement workers. So around 540 non-union employees were brought in, while then about 500 union members crossed the picket line. Tensions rose enough that the first ever Iron Range Governor, Rudy Perpich, sent the National Guard in to protect non-union workers. The strike continued to drag on, and then eventually the parent union tried to force an end to the strike. The local P9 didn't want to do it. Then those officials were suspended from the union, and essentially the strike was over and was broken in this way. And so while the strike did ultimately fail, and only about 20% of workers who went on strike got their jobs back, it did prove that militant rank and file members are essential to the movement. But we also see, again, all of those different types of tactics were used on this big particular strike. Okay. So, wait a second. There we go. I was jumping ahead, I'm sorry. So now that we have a sense of things for the country and a little bit of the state of Minnesota, how did this all affect the Iron Range specifically? So going again from national to statewide to local history, right? So those of you who were around the Iron Range in the 1980s, you probably remember that it was a fairly rough decade for people tied to the mining industry. Layoffs were a regular occurrence during this decade, culminating in the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. And during a shutdown in 1982, unemployment reached 25% in Hibbing and potentially 50 to 60% unemployment in other towns on the range. Automation and competition with foreign steel were common factors to these shutdowns. But, like with most things, Iron Rangers didn't take this lying down. One way that many let their voices heard was during a rally in August of 1984, not on my birthday though, don't worry. But it was at a rally in August 1984 in Chisholm for a piece of legislation called the Fair Trade in Steel Act. And so here are some photos from that rally in Chisholm that are actually part of our Lois Jensen collection. She donated several dozen photos from this particular rally to our collection here. So in short, the Fair Trade in Steel Act was an attempt to impose quotas on imported iron ore and essentially help communities that were facing these high unemployment rates within the steel industry. Unfortunately, though, it was held up in the Ways and Means Committee and then was never put forth to a vote. But you can see plenty of people from the local communities that obviously came out to that rally. Okay, so again, like I mentioned before, I know what I probably just threw at you was fairly depressing, especially if you also earn your paycheck by selling your labor. However, we do need to face the facts of history if we are to truly learn from them. I deal in real material conditions when looking at history, not comforting facts or not stories that only make me feel good. All that I just shared helps lay the foundation of what we as a country and region were going through when the Hibbing 7 decided to begin their strike. Again, the strike didn't materialize out of nowhere, and so all of that context I showed you plays a significant part of this story. And so we are finally ready to begin the journey, again, of Linda Carpenter, Betty Yudnich, Mary Suzik, Ruth Johnson, Roberta Hasimovich, Marge Richards, and Linda Perry. So before they went on strike, can you see where I kind of got the color palette, though? I thought I was being a little cheeky by borrowing it. Anyways, so before they went on strike, these women worked at the American Linen Supply Company in Hibbing. At this point in time, the company was based in Minneapolis and was a nationwide firm. It provided laundry, linen, and uniform rentals and had a fleet of delivery trucks. So workers would wash, iron, and fold linens and uniforms, and then truck drivers would deliver them to various companies that rented their services. Those working at American Linen Supply were represented by the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Local 1116. They had been the collective bargaining representative at the Hibbing plant for about 20 years, and there were 42 employees at this plant represented by the UFCW. The Teamsters represented the truck drivers for American Linen Supply down in Duluth. I am going to take a drink of water real quick. Okay. So the UFCW contract was set to expire in December of 1986. Negotiations had not finished by this expiration date, and so the contract was extended through January of 1987 to allow for the union and company to come to terms. However, this did not happen. There were several issues related to this breakdown in negotiations. Some included basic working conditions, as it could become very unbearable to work in the plant due to extreme heat. Temperatures could even reach above 100 degrees in the summertime as they're doing laundry and ironing and steaming and all of that. Furthermore, there were stated unfair labor practices, such as hiring non-union full-time workers, not following a seniority list, and not posting properly for jobs. On top of this, the company and union could not agree on wage increases and the retirement plan. While they agreed on the wage increase scale, the union wanted the raises to take effect that July. The company didn't want it to happen until 1988. Furthermore, the company wanted employees to choose between the union's pension plan and an individual retirement account, or IRA. The company argued that they pay 60 cents per hour into the pension plan, but most of it goes to union administrative costs. They also claimed that IRAs would be better for workers since they could use their pension money earlier. Employees had to work 10 years to qualify for money from the union's pension plan. However, the union voted against replacing a union pension plan with IRAs. They didn't mind waiting 10 years for access to their pension, and were worried about being penalized for IRA withdrawals. And so this move away from union pensions to either IRAs or 401ks is actually also a major trend in the workforce in the US today. And I won't get into the weeds here, but this is an important factor in these types of negotiations. While companies like to make it seem that you might have more control over your money and retirement investments, which is probably pretty true, and especially if you're very interested in doing that, it's still, though, a way for them to shift risks from themselves then onto the employees. Employers no longer have to worry about long-term financial obligations and can focus more on their own profits. For many workers, this shift away from pensions means they don't know when or if they can ever retire. With a standard pension, workers know in advance how much they're getting for their lifetime retirement income. Additionally, there are survivor and disability protections and post-retirement benefit increases. And my mom was an educator for over 30 years, was union all her life, and was absolutely able to retire in security at the age of 56 thanks to her union pension. Anyways. In January of 1987, the union took a vote on whether or not to strike. All but 2 of the 40 union employees were in favor, but they did not do so at this time because obviously negotiations were still ongoing. However, in February 1987, American Linen Supply stated that they will hire replacement workers should the union go out on strike. According to the company, they took a number of job applications during January in case a strike was declared. Again, think back to the tactics that I had listed before. The company has already done one of them and threatened another one. They bargained to an impasse, heard about a potential strike, and said replacement workers would stop the strike from affecting them. The strike was not declared at this time, however, and negotiations basically stalled until the fall of 1987. In September, another vote was taken on whether or not to go on strike. Of the 17 members that showed up for that strike vote, 11 voted in favor of a strike. Thus, on October 2nd, 1987, the strike started. However, in the early morning hours, only the Hibbing 7 showed up on the picket line. And around 6:15 a.m., the district manager of the plant arrives and sees the 7 women with signs. He then goes into the plant and calls one of the union presidents to inform him that striking employees will be permanently replaced. He then returns to the picket line sometime between 6:30 and 6:45 a.m. to distribute a handwritten notice, and it stated, quote, "To the striking employees of American Linen Hibbing, you have until 7 a.m. on Friday, October 2nd to return to work. If you have not, you are permanently replaced. You have the right to continue your hospitalization and medical coverage at your expense. Those forms will be given to you," end quote. The women refused, and they kept striking. So the 7 women continued on their picket lines and kept making their signs. Again, you can see here, there's Linda Perry. And then this is the union's business agent, Russ Johnson, who will also have a bit of a role to play during the strike. So according to documents that would later be revealed from a court ruling, 4 days after the strike started, the first attempt at decertifying the union was underway. On October 6, 1987, an employee asked the personnel manager if there was something to sign to get the union out of the plant. The personnel manager handed her a withdrawal card that stated, "I blank no longer desire to have local number 1116 represent me as my bargaining agent effective of blank." The personnel manager then stated that this employee would need to get it notarized by a notary public who happened to be in the employee lunchroom at this time. This particular notary public was an employee at the Security State Bank in Hibbing, where the district manager of the American Linen plant was a director. The employee stated that she saw several similar documents on the notary's desk. The personnel manager then tried to circulate more withdrawal cards. One man, Matthew Caroon, which was the union's shop steward, declined this request. So in all, 26 notarized employee statements were notarized by employees of Security State Bank and were sent certified mail to the union. The union did not honor these statements as they believed they were not the true expression of the employees and were employer-sponsored. So regardless, on the basis of these signed statements, American Linen withdrew recognition of the union on October 6, 1987. Months later, the National Labor Relations Board was contacted by an employee about the union's decertification. The board representative expressed there was no record of decertification. Also, it is incredibly hard to say decertification this many times, but bear with me. So the board representative expressed that there was no record of decertification, but sent this employee a decertification petition. That employee then typed up the petition letter in the personnel manager's office with the assistance of said personnel manager. So the decertification petition was then filed on December 30th, 1987. In January of 1988, the union then filed unfair labor practice charges with the National Labor Relations Board. So this board is an independent federal agency that was created as a result of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. So among other things, this act basically says that it is illegal to prevent workers from trying to unionize. And so the NLRB was then created to enforce US labor laws as it relates to collective bargaining and unfair labor practices. And it supervises elections for union representation as well as investigates and remedies unfair labor practices. And the particular complaints filed by the UCFW Local 1116 were endorsed by the General Counsel of the board, but it would be several months until the findings of these charges were decided upon. And one of the most interesting pieces of evidence found for this filing was a document given to the women by an anonymous source. The document consists of a letter to the district manager from William Harding, an attorney from Lincoln, Nebraska. He was retained by American Linen to represent the company at negotiations at several plants in the Midwest. The firm that he worked for, Nelson and Harding, was on the AFL-CIO's list of union-busting firms. The letter itself was dated a few weeks before the strike began. It was written in preparation for a meeting Harding would have with various district managers. The letter included a recap of negotiations in 2 districts, which led to non-union status at 7 facilities. So, while these claims were being decided upon, the women received a massive boon from then presidential candidate, Reverend Jesse Jackson, of all people, meaning just that it was sheer happenstance that as I was working on this, he passed, and it was just one of those weird coincidences in life, right? Anyways, Jackson traveled to Minnesota in early January 1988 and made a pit stop in Hibbing, Duluth, and Bemidji to promote the importance of education and labor. And while speaking at the Hibbing High School auditorium, he shed light on the fight of the Hibbing Seven and then brought them up on stage with him. He likened labor struggles to basically a type of economic violence of the 1980s and how American workers were suffering. And he actually tried to do a similar thing during the Hormel strike and attempted to mediate to help the P9 workers down there. But so you can see him here. This is him actually at UMD. There's his little Bulldogs jacket, right? Unfortunately, I didn't get any photos of him when he was in Hibbing, but I digress. Anyways, here is another familiar face that some of you guys might know. That is Governor Rudy Perpich. Also, I do, at this point, do want to say a special thank you to the Catherine A. Martin Library down at UMD. I've been working with their archivists there who are awesome, and they have a collection of photos from the Duluth News Tribune and have sent me a lot of really good stuff that I'm using throughout this presentation. So, anyways. Excuse me. In March 1988, the NLRB had finally made a decision on their case. They confirmed that the women were fired illegally and that the company, quote, overly participated in the decertification of the union. While the legal battle was not over yet due to an appeal, this decision did boost their spirits. The women did have support from the community, however, many thought that it was a losing battle. At this time, the economy was not particularly great for the taconite industry. Jobs were very scarce. The Hibbing city councilor and former steelworker was quoted saying, "Unions are at a point where they've got their backs to the wall. This used to be one of the biggest union places there was. Now you don't have that many people going to meetings. People are scared and they're moving out. The economy is tough. It's not like it was before." But regardless of these sentiments, the women continued on. So during the spring of 1988, a strike support committee was established among the strikers and fellow unionists, spouses, and members of the public. I believe we have someone who was part of that committee in the audience back there. David? Okay, anyways. Throughout the remainder of the strike, though, they assisted the women in gaining publicity, support from politicians, and then even a boycott against American Linen Supply, which I'll kind of talk a little bit about later. And the first major event organized by this group was a rally held in Bennett Park in June of 1988. Iron Range Labor Assembly member Tom Pender stated, quote, "This rally will show that working people across the range support the stand taken by the 7 strikers at American Linen." The committee was able to publicize this rally via radio commercials featuring actor Ed Asner, who I know from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and the real-life Norma Ray, Crystal Lee Sutton, traveled to Hibbing from Burlington, North Carolina to speak on behalf of the striking women. For those of you not in the know, Norma Ray was a movie featuring Sally Field about workers seeking a union at a textile factory in North Carolina. And so Sutton, who is right here, she said during that rally, quote, "Be proud of what you do. It's going to make a difference. If we don't tell the truth, if we don't help each other, we'll be sinking and sinking fast." Striker Betty Yudnich said, quote, "If they continue to break unions, what future will our children and grandchildren have?" John Marino, past president of Local 94 for the Hibbing Public Utilities, went to the rally to show support as well. He said, quote, "I've been union all my life. Everything we fought for, they're trying to take away a little at a time. So folk singer Larry Long, who's not up there yet, whoops, he performed, I think it was in the last slide. That's Larry Long, thank you, okay. He came up with he wrote and performed a song called 7 Strong Women. I took a little bit of inspiration for that with the 7 women strong. But I think that's also the first time that they started to actually be called then the Hibbing 7, maybe. If I'm wrong, please correct me, but that was really when they first started being called that in the newspapers. So their business agent, Russ Johnson, also stated, quote, "We think mining companies are watching and many other employers with unions. We think it's going to have an impact on their negotiating strategy and posture with all those unions. The issue is not only these 7 women, but all of organized labor." Okay, so in September of 1988, there's so many decisions and appeals, so just bear with me as we get through these, right? Because that's kind of the slow justice of the court system, right? It's both a blessing and a curse. But so in September of 1988, an administrative law judge agreed with the NLRB that the union had a proper claim to unfair labor practices. Judge Robert Leiner said it was obvious from testimony that the company had fired the strikers and hired strike replacement workers. It is the right of employees to engage in a lawful strike in support of economic demands and is fundamental to the National Labor Relations Act. Additionally, employees cannot be fired until permanent replacements have been hired, and that was not done in this instance. He further stated that the company used the firings to intimidate non-striking employees into signing a petition to decertify their union. Striker Mary Suzik said, quote, "I guess I can understand why they didn't go out. There are a lot of women in there who are their family's sole support. Still, it kind of hurts. If everyone had gone out, the strike wouldn't have gone on this long. Now whatever we've won, they'll get too." Striker Betty Udnich commented, "I don't expect thank yous from them, but I feel we didn't do it just for them. We've done this for all unions everywhere and for all womanhood. Women are intimidated in today's work field. We saw through this business the company was trying to shove down our throats. We're winning, and I think women can be encouraged by that." It was now up to American Linen on whether or not to appeal, and they eventually would. But to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the strike, the UFCW Local 1116 and the Iron Range Labor Assembly began a rally at 5:30 a.m. at the plant gates on October 3rd, 1988. Greeted with a brisk 35 degrees and wind, several dozen labor leaders from Duluth and the Range were at the plant that morning to lend aid, to the Hibbing 7. The Iron Range Labor Assembly, which represented about 11,000 workers on the Range, threatened to lead a boycott against the firm. So I love this. This is such a good photo too, by the way. So the appeals dragged the case on, and after 2 years on strike, the women heard back from yet another ruling by the NLRB. In October of 1989, the court ruled to reinstate all 7 women at the plant, give them back pay, and stated that the decertification of the union be dismissed. The company would eventually appeal this decision again, forcing it to go up to the courts one step further. This further reflected the trend where companies would rather spend their money in the court than negotiating with unions. Johnson, again, the union's business agent, stated, "They've already spent 50 times more to fight this than it would have cost just to meet the workers' demands." And it hadn't been an easy 2 years on these women. The Star Tribune did kind of a small profile of each of them and shared what they had been through since they went out on strike 2 years prior. So Betty Udnich, then 48, lost 4 family members and her best friend. She stated, "We're not trying to be an inspiration to anybody. We're doing it for self-respect, a refusal to let yourself be a doormat." Linda Perry, 33, had a 3-year-old son at this time. She said, he can't say scab, so he says sab. Linda Carpenter, then 44, became a first-time grandmother. She had landed a job at the ill-fated chopsticks factory, which still owed her a couple of paychecks in 1989. Suzik, then 61, said they'd stick it out even if the company appealed. Quote, "We're probably stronger now than when we went on strike." Marge Richards, 52 at the time, married twice and raised 7 children before joining American Linen Supply in 1982. She said, quote, "I feel good about myself for standing up for the right thing." Ruth Johnson, then 53, began cleaning homes while on strike. Roberta Hisimovich, 47, was married to a union plumber. Her father was a miner as well. And then when she went to American Linen to work, it was, quote, because it was known as the only place in Hibbing where a woman could get decent pay and benefits. Hisimovich claimed she went on strike to preserve those things. Okay, there we go. Looks like they're like waiting to like release their next album here. It's just really cool. Which, by the way, I did see someone wearing one of these Hibbing 7 jackets, which are all, we'll talk later because, anyways, they're awesome jackets. Anyways, okay. So, in November of 1989, the company stated that it would not comply with the NLRB ruling to rehire the 7 women with back pay. And so this was after a panel affirmed the administrative law judge's ruling in 1988. And the Minneapolis region NLRB director said that if American Linen refused to comply, they would then have to ask a federal appeals court to enforce the order because they didn't have enforcement powers, only the courts did at that time. Okay, we're getting there. Bear with me. So regardless of the setback, the 7 women and their supporters continued their fight. And in January of 1990, they began a billboard campaign in Hibbing with conjunction from support from 2 other, oh my gosh, I clicked, there we go. So you can see 2 other local unions, well, one in Fargo and then one from Nashwauk, teamed up with them to kind of do this billboard campaign. And it was essentially to try and pressure the city officials in Hibbing to help with mediations because they just wanted to get back to resume some good faith bargaining. But at this time, American Linen executives refused to comment on the union's actions. And then in February of 1990, the Duluth City Council voted to stop doing business with American Linen Supply. And it was a 7-2 vote to reject the bid that they had offered and to open up the contract for rebidding. Duluth was the latest city to join in on this boycott alongside Keewatin, Nashwauk, and Aurora Hoyt Lakes School District. Union business agent Johnson stated, quote, "The only thing this company understands is something that affects them financially." So the city councilors of Duluth said that American Linen's actions against labor showed poor character, bad judgment, and were irresponsible, which gave them grounds to reject the contract. Okay, so March 1990 proved to be just as busy with the protest, just as busy because they decided to go protest at the firm's headquarters in downtown Minneapolis on International Women's Day. And the Fargo Teamsters joined the women, and then they helped lead a demonstration at the Steiner Corporation, which again is the owner of American Linen Supply. So they chartered buses to assist anyone coming from either North Dakota or northern Minnesota. And oddly enough, in this photo here, you can see this gentleman here is holding a sign that says, "The Wildcat Strikers of International Falls support the Hibbing 7." I could go into a whole other presentation on this Wildcat strike because at the same time up in International Falls, there were dozens of union members out on strike without the support of their national union against the new paper mill plant that had gone up there. And there was a specific contractor brought in from Alabama who was notorious for hiring non-union workers. So it's kind of, again, cool to see. So you see Iron Range Labor Assembly, you see these guys. It's this cross-labor support of one another and supporting these 7 women. Okay, so then finally, on December 11th, 1991, after 1,530 days on strike, the Hibbing 7 received the news that American Linen Supply would finally adhere to the NLRB rulings and rehire the women as well as recognize their union as a bargaining group for that plant. American Linen had decided to stop further legal challenges as the only other appeal that it would have was to the US Supreme Court. And this court order had been upheld during 3 earlier attempts at appeal. And so, after setting their alarms for 5 a.m. once more, the 7 women finally returned to work at the American Linen Supply Company on December 30th, 1991. Most were incredibly nervous to return. Richards even said, quote, "I'm so nervous I could barf." And I'm not just kidding. Hisimovich stated, quote, "I think I'm more nervous now than when we went out on strike." So all 7, though, were able to return without incident. And so while some photos were taken to commemorate their return, like this one, the district manager did tell reporters to leave the building after rejecting a request to interview other employees. The women did get 2 more victory laps after returning to work. The Iron Range Labor Assembly hosted a celebration at their Carpenter Hall in Virginia, and then following this, Senator Paul Wellstone also honored the women during a labor rally he held at the Hibbing Memorial Building in February of 1992. Anyone who knows me knows I had to get a photo from the 1916 strike in here, okay? Just bear with me, bear with me. So what these 7 women went through to get their jobs and union back is astounding. Most would have thrown in the proverbial American linen supply towel long before 4 years. In fact, a lot of employers rely on this. Labor historian Peter Ratcliffe mentioned that having to wait for labor courts to help workers is a form of slow justice. It wears on strikers and their supporters, as well as prevents other workers from joining the strike. Several American Linen employees said that they would have happily joined the women, but they just could not afford to miss a paycheck. And that is a reality for a lot of people. Time and money is something the majority of workers do not have. However, what we can learn from this is militancy, not falling for intimidation or for common union busting tactics, thinking beyond yourself in the moment and what this might mean for the labor movement as a whole. One small victory can help spark others. And so now all labor is important in the struggle for equality against capital. Without everyone coming together, regardless of gender, sex, race, or immigrant status, we're going to have a long road ahead in the fight for social and economic justice. Having said that, what the Hibbing 7 strike shows us is that women on the Iron Range are and always have been as integral to the labor movement up here as men. Historically, a lot of the main industries in the region are masculine, whatever that term might mean. However, even when women were not directly walking off the job site or standing on the picket line for their jobs, they were supporting the men who were doing those things. Since the beginning of the labor movement on the Iron Range, women have been on the front lines. Historically, they have thrown rotten eggs at scabs, upturned their lunch pails, punched and bit mining company deputies. They were arrested and thrown in jail with their babies, only to be back on the picket lines the following morning after making bail. If they weren't on the line themselves, then they were supporting the household while their main source of income was on strike. They took on extra jobs, maintained the house, and tried to give the rest of the family a sense of normalcy. Women have always been crucial to the labor movement, even before they were allowed to join labor unions. And so, this strike may have only included 7 women on paper, but it helped bring together the local labor movement at a time when nationally it was at its lowest. Many in the community thought it was a lost cause, and they were sad that there were only 7 of them. But I think these women realized what was on the line for labor if they allowed union busting tactics to flourish. Their strike was not just about themselves, but about fighting the precedent that this would set. They themselves attributed their resilience to their own local history. Striker Mary Suzik was quoted saying, "When I was a girl, I listened to the adults downstairs talking in Serbian about life before the union. When they talked about the foreman, they used the F word, and they called him an SOB." So the Iron Range's legacy of fervent unionism practiced by their immigrant ancestors was what kept them going. And so I will end tonight's talk with another quote from Hibbing 7 member Bobby Hisemovich. Quote, "We never did it for fame. We did it because we felt we should stick together for what is right. I hope we've set an example for other women to stand up for your rights and what you believe in." And with that, thank you again for coming out for my talk tonight. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them now. Also, of course, I have reading material for all of you. Homework, if you want to learn more. But anyways, thank you. Love homework. Perfect.